Hello Anglophonians, and welcome to another episode where we take a look at the European comic culture and the history of the Europa Park. But this time it's a new comic culture. Well, we've already touched this. The funny pocketbooks, Disney made in Europe. Well, I thought maybe we should look at some of the stories that were produced in Europe. And we start with the story that started the funny pocketbooks in Germany altogether, the Columbus butterfly. The first book in the series Walt Disney's Funny Pocketbooks was published in Germany on October 1st, 1967. The comics included in this book come from Italy and have previously been published there. What we see here is the cover image of this first edition. You can see it in the prices, which are still quoted in currencies that were merged into the euro in the 1990s. The title of the book is also unusual for the first editions of the series. You can literally translate it as The Columbus Butterfly and Other Adventures. From the second book onwards, the publisher decided to change the type of book titles. From number 2 onwards, not one story was picked out of the book and used as a title, but separate titles were created. Sometimes these had something to do with the framework stories, with which the individual stories in the books were connected. Before we start with the stories, anyone who actually owns a book from the first edition, like we see it here, can count themselves lucky. These books sell for several $1,000s these days. A copy of this first edition can currently be found on eBay, starting price $9,999. But back to the story, and thus to the framework story. The book begins with this framework story, and I want to mention it here because the idea of a framework story creates a problem, especially with Disney stories. This problem will be discussed later. The framework story begins with Donald having so much debt that he burns his bills and burns down his house as a consequence. He is convicted of arson and ends up in prison, where he is visited by Daisy Duck. Donald is upset that if he's in prison, well, who wouldn't be? And Daisy tells him to calm down. Otherwise, the story would end like this story with the Columbus butterfly. And Donald remembers. Which is where the real story about the Columbus butterfly begins. And now a little spoiler warning. In order to take a closer look at the story and the special features of the Funny Pocketbooks, the content of the entire story, including the plot twists, is reproduced here. The story begins with Uncle Scrooge, who, as usual, is having fun with having a vault full of money. But suddenly he receives an unexpected visit from Brigitta McBridge, a woman who's madly in love with him. If you're out there wondering who Brigitta McBridge is, we'll find out more about her later. Brigitta is in the fabric business and makes excellent profits because she has a secret recipe for special patterns. Donald and his nephews are in Costa Rica and send her pictures of butterflies that she uses for the patterns. Of course, Scrooge, who's also in the fabric business, doesn't like Brigitta's winnings at all, and so he decides to spy on her to see where she gets her patterns from. To do this, he brings Donald back from Costa Rica to Duckburg without knowing that he is in fact the one who gives Brigitta the fabric patterns. Of course, Donald doesn't want to help him, and so he soon flies back to Costa Rica. But in the meantime, his nephew stayed behind and made an amazing discovery: a butterfly with a treasure map that seems to have come from Columbus. Of course, they immediately start looking. But what they find is not what they expected. Shortly afterwards, Donald returns and they show him the butterfly and tell him that they want to trick Scrooge with the treasure map. So they send the butterfly to Duckburg, and not long after, Scrooge, who of course doesn't miss a good treasure hunt, is in Costa Rica. But the Beagle Boys also got wind of the treasure, and because Brigida used the butterfly motif in her fabrics, they unfortunately also have a treasure map. They are ahead and set all sorts of traps for the ducks and are the first to reach the treasure. But as Donald's nephews, they too are disappointed by the contents of the treasure chest. Finally, Scrooge arrives too. He opens the chest and finds a poem. Of course, he's shocked at first, but then he reads the poem again. He who searches in vain for luck on a winding path in the distance does not find it nearby. Scrooge realizes that the poem shows the way to the treasure, and shortly afterwards he's found it because the starting point of the treasure hunt was a huge rock in the shape of a 4-leaf clover. Well, luck if you want to. It turns out that the rock is actually made of pure gold. Donald and the nephews, who thought they were playing a prank on Scrooge, are of course disappointed, but Scrooge is happy. Well, yeah. But in the end, Scrooge drops a part of the gold treasure over Donald and his nephew's camp, so that they get their share. The end. First of all, let's talk about the comic artist who invented and drew the story, Romano Scarpa. Born September 27, 1927 in Venice in Italy, died April 23, 2005 in Malaga in Spain. He was a comic artist and author as well as an animator. Emulating his role model Walt Disney, he started with animation but came to Disney Comics in 1952, where he was active both as an illustrator and as an author for over 50 years. After studying at the Venice Art Academy, he set up an animation studio in his hometown. At the same time, in 1947, he tried to gain a foothold at the Italian publisher Mondadori. The publisher brought out the Walt Disney comics for the Italian market in a magazine called Topolino. However, so many comics came from the USA from Carl Barks and Floyd Gottfredson that Mondadori only needed one duo to produce their own comics, the author Guido Martina and the illustrator Angelo Bioletto. But just 5 years later, the situation had changed. The demand for Disney comics was huge in Europe. In 1952, Scarpa officially began working for Italian Disney comics. At first, he was primarily an illustrator, illustrating stories written by Guido Martina. But after there were no more stories from Floyd Gottfredson, Scarpa's chance to follow in his footsteps came. Scarpa drew Mickey Mouse stories that were crime novels, but also adventure stories with the Duck family. He also invented new characters to enrich the Disney universe. One of them is Brigida McBridge, who makes her second appearance in The Columbus Butterfly. Scarpa invented her in 1960 for the story Uncle Scrooge and the Last Ballaboo. In total, Scarpa invented 30 new characters for the Disney universe, which were later taken up by other artists. Beginning in 1988, some of his stories were published by Gladstone Publishing in the United States. This made him the first Italian Disney author ever to come to America, the home country of Disney. Scarpa spent the last years of his life in Spain for health reasons. He died on April 23, 2005, after greatly enriching the Disney universe, and his death was a great loss not only for Disney, but for comic book culture in general. Let's talk about Brigida McBridge. As already mentioned, she made her first appearance in 1960. The Columbus Butterfly was written and drawn by Scarpa in 1962. Here we see the characteristics that defined Brigida. Firstly, her love for Scrooge McDuck, and secondly, her business acumen. Even if she works something different in each story, she always owns her own company. Most of the time she competes with Scrooge. In this story, she owns a fabric factory and has a brilliant idea to invent new patterns for these fabrics. Otherwise, she doesn't have much to do in the story. She's not connected to the treasure hunt at all. The story itself is cleverly written, especially with the plot twist at the end and Columbus's treasure. Scarpa drew historical inspiration for the story from Christopher Columbus's fourth and final voyage, which lasted from 1502 to 1504 and during which the explorer first reached the coast of Central America. For me, the difficulties with the story begin where the story in fact ends. Because in this canon of stories, there was, of course, a status quo that had to be maintained. The story ends with Uncle Scrooge giving Donald and the nephews some of the gold treasure. But the framework story started with Donald having so much debt that he burns his bill. The framework story, after the end of the Columbus butterfly, had to ensure that Donald lost his gold again. And this is what happens. When he tries to bring his gold across the border, he is stopped by customs. He is accused of smuggling and his gold is confiscated. It was this status quo that frustrated me as a child and ultimately turned me away from these stories as I got older, despite all the nostalgia, the constant standstill. Yes, there were and are many authors who write the stories, so it's not possible to reconcile them all. But it was particularly frustrating at the time, especially since Donald's debt was something that at some point particularly characterized him. I can't count the number of times Uncle Scrooge blackmails Donald into going on expeditions because Donald is deeply in debt. And no matter how many times Donald earns enough money to pay off his debts or receives a treasure of gold as a gift, by the time the next story rolls around, he's back to being poor and in debt. On the other hand, we have Uncle Scrooge, who is not only perversely rich, but also has an unhealthy relationship with money. His riches are never enough for him. He wants more and more. Not only that, just as it happens in the Columbus butterfly, it often happens that Uncle Scrooge is even richer at the end of a story than before. In fact, there was a very slow development over time, and today the motives of the stories are no longer the same as they were back then. But within these motives, there is a standstill, just as it was back then. And that's a shame, because a lot of clever and well-crafted stories came from Italy. We'll take a look at a few more of them when we get a chance, eventually. So there you have it, The Columbus Butterfly, a Disney story but made in Europe. Next time we take another look at the history of the Europa Park. Until then, like and subscribe. Take good care of yourself and see you.